I'm going to be doing the brakes on my 2010 Triumph Bonneville today. The rear pads and the front pads. And honestly, the pads are in fine shape. There's nothing wrong with them. But I wanted to just remove the calipers and take a look at what's in there as far as dirt and debris and clean them up a little bit. And while I'm there, the pads are so cheap that I'm going to replace them with some newer ones that should be a little bit better performance anyway. So I'm going to start with the rear caliper. And I'm actually going to do some of this with the camera off because it's hard to get in there to see. But just to show you what I'm going to be doing, first there's two Allen bolts here, a 5mm Allen bolt here and here. And I'm just going to loosen those with the caliper still on the bike just because it's easier to do that. And those are what hold the pads in place. And then to remove the caliper to get at the pads, there's a bolt here and one more up here you can't see off camera, which is a 14mm, and I'm just going to remove those and drop the caliper down. Sometimes it's easier to take the exhaust off, but I'm just too lazy to do that, so I'm just going to leave it in place. So let me remove the caliper and then I'll put you back on camera. I'm trying to give you another shot here. I've got the caliper off, and that's from these two little bolts right here, which are actually quite clean and were not difficult to get off, which I'm pleased about. I actually have one of the pads out, and you know it's not bad at all. There's definitely more life there, but I did purchase new ones because they're pretty cheap. So since I got this thing off, these may be slightly better quality than the ones that came stock, which is what I got on here. And right now I'm just removing these are those two bolts that hold the pads in place. So I'm removing those. It's a 5mm Allen wrench, as I mentioned. I'll try to get a shot in here. You shouldn't really leave this caliper hanging, but that's what it looks like. You can see the bolts, that shiny bolt there on top, starting to come out. So let me just finish removing these and put the camera down for a second. Okay, I have the pins out that hold the pads in place, and they're in good shape. I didn't want to see any corrosion, and there's just a little bit of dirt there. It's nothing big at all. Those look excellent shape. So I'm just going to clean them up. And again, like these pads are practically new. I mean, they don't need replacing, but it was so cheap to buy the new ones, so I'm just going to replace them. And I'll show you the inside here. Oh boy, it's hard to get the camera in here, but notice there's a spring clip. You want to make sure that's in good shape. And when I put the new pads in, they may be slightly thicker. So I'm going to want to push these pistons back in. And I'm going to clean off the caliper just with warm soapy water in here just to make sure there's no dirt on the piston itself that I'm pushing into the seal. And then I want you to pay attention to this right here. I'll take this little rubber cap off, and that's the bleeder, which I am going to use because I want to make sure I replace all of the brake fluid in there with new brake fluid, which is a good idea to do as you're changing the pads. This is a 2010 and I'm recording this in 2014. There's about 7,000 miles on this bike, I guess, or a little more than that actually, maybe 7,500. So again, it's in very good shape, and I was hoping not to see too much corrosion or anything here, and I don't, so I'm very pleased with what I see. But it's just a good idea to keep this clean, and you do some maintenance once in a while. And for the cost of the new pads, I don't mind putting some new ones on. The fronts may be a little bit more worn, we'll see in a minute, but I'm just going to clean this up with some warm soapy water and we'll put it back together. Just try to give you a better shot here of the new and old disc pads. It's pretty tough to see here, and I'm trying to hold it with the camera and the light and everything, but the new pad is actually not quite double the size of the old one. So there is some more wear there than I was aware of, but there's still plenty of life on the old ones. But the other thing I wanted to make you aware of, I've now cleaned this up. Let's see if I can get the camera in there. And I got one pad in there. There's springs, you want to make sure that the pads are seated correctly in that spring in the back there. Other than that, this is pretty simple. I made sure the pistons can move easily, so I could move it back and forth with my fingers, and then I pushed them both in so that I can seat the new pads, which are a little bit thicker. And other than that, it's just a matter of putting the new pad in, and then we'll remount the caliper on the back here. All right, as I'm tightening this caliper back up, I just want to give you some information that might be helpful for you. They do give torque wrench settings, although it's in the wrong format for me, so I've converted it over here for what I'm doing. The pad retaining pins on the front and back are 13.2 foot-pounds. And interestingly, the front caliper and the back caliper have different settings. I'm not sure why, but the rear caliper is 29.5 foot-pounds, and on the front, when we get to that, it'll be 20.65 foot-pounds for the bolts that attach the caliper to its frame there. Okay, I'm here on the front now, and this is going to be a little easier to show you on camera. Again, there's two bolts that hold the caliper on here and here. This time they're a 12 millimeter for some reason. I don't know why they can't standardize on that. And then there is a little pin that holds the pad in place here, but it's covered up with a little plug, I guess for corrosion. I'm not sure why. So you got to, boy, I got to go look for that. You take that little plug out first, and then you're back to the 5 millimeter Allen wrench. So I'm just going to loosen that up just so it's not difficult. And then switch to my 12, and we'll loosen up these bolts, which aren't really that tight. Alright, now let me just move the camera and get this caliper off the way. I'm trying to get some better light for you. I've got the caliper removed now. Up here, I don't know if you can see that on camera, I have a little plastic tie that I've tied off to the bike up top here, just so the caliper's not hanging on the cable. So hopefully you can see this, but here are the old pads in place. And again, it's not any emergency, although they are somewhat worn. It's got 7,560 miles on it, I just looked. So we're just going to take these pads out. Oh, I didn't take the pin out yet. That'll help. First, we've got to take this pin out in the bottom, which I loosened when it was on the still attached to the bike. And just like the rear, you got to remove this totally. It's under a little bit of spring pressure, so it's kind of a pain to get out. There. Alright, so there's the pin. Looks like it's in good shape. And the pads just pop right out. And these are the original pads. They're really not awful, but they are getting down there. I mean, I could get more life out of them, but I'm not that cheap. So the new pads are here. Let me just get these open and we'll put them in. Alright, just like I did with the rear brake, I'm just going to give these things a little bath. Don't want to lose that spring there. And I'm mostly concerned about this area right where the pistons go into the seals. I don't want any dirt or stuff in there to damage the seal. So I'm just going to clean this out with some warm soapy water, and I'll probably dry it off with some brake clean just to make sure all the water's out of there and we're in good shape. Alright, I'm going to try to show you with the pads in place here. This is more difficult to film than I thought. Again, I had this little plastic tie up here holding everything in place so it's not hanging. But that's with the pads in. You just want to make sure there's a spring under here. You just make sure you don't lose that. And this pin is what holds the pads in place. And it's easier to get the pin started and put it through the first hole, and then put the second pad in and put it through the second hole. And again, I just have this hand tightened right now. I'll tighten it later when it's on the bike. And then up top, boy, I don't know if I can get this. Make sure there's a spring up here. I need something to point with. There's a spring up here, and there's just a little tab right there. I don't know if you can see it, but that needs to be kind of holding the pad in place. So as long as you get those two springs correct, there's not much else to go wrong. Now we just need to oh, and by the way, I did check the pistons, cleaned them off first, and then pushed them all the way back into the cylinders after they were cleaned, so I didn't damage the seals. All right, so I'm just going to put this back on the fork of the bike, get it mounted, and then we're going to talk about bleeding. Okay, I've got the front caliper back on, and now I want to bleed the brakes. The reason for this is that there's no air in the lines. I mean, it's fine as far as that, but over time, brake fluid can get just dirty and dingy, and it can absorb water, I guess, even though it is a closed system. And it's just a good idea as it wears down to replace it with new fluid. And Triumph recommends this. What we're using is .4, which I think doesn't absorb water as much as Dot 3 used to in the old days, but it's still, it goes bad over time. So you want to replace it, and it's not that big a deal. Right here is the bleeder, and this is a closed hydraulic system, so if we go up top here, I've opened up the reservoir here, and actually you can see the fluid's a little bit yellow, and that's how you can usually tell when it's getting old. It gets a little yellow or brown. So I'm going to replace that, and it should be a much clearer liquid when we're all done. Now, the last thing you want to do is introduce air into the system. So there's 3 ways that I know of to bleed brakes. One is you get a helper, and the helper pushes down on the pedal or pulls the lever, and then once that pressure is on the system, you take a wrench, you loosen this bleeder screw, which is hollow in the middle, of course, and the brake fluid will spit out. And then you need to retighten that before the person helping you is finished pulling down all the way, because otherwise air could get back in the system. So it's a continuing cycle of pulling the brakes, loosening the screw to let some fluid out, tightening it back up before the lever hits bottom, and then you just repeat that cycle, and the fluid will eventually come through. And that's the old school method of doing it. A newer method, which I prefer, but I'm not prepared to do today, is to replace this bleeder with they're called speed bleeders, and basically it looks just like this, but it's got a check valve in it, a ball bearing check valve. So fluid can only go one way. So with that system, you loosen this up a little bit, and you can just pull that that lever or push the pedal down repeatedly, and fluid will come out, but air can't get in because of that check valve. And when you're done, you just tighten it back up. Those work great, especially if you're alone. But I don't have that with me right now. I'm not prepared to go out to the parts store and buy them. So I'm going to use a third method, which is this little device here. It's made by MidiVac, and there may be others too. But basically, this is just a vacuum. It's used actually in automotive applications for creating vacuum or measuring vacuum. And you pull this lever, and it creates a vacuum. So that tube is going to be connected to this little cup here. And then the rest of that tube goes here, and I'm going to see if I can do this with 2 hands here. I'm going to attach the end of this tube to the bleeder screw. So what happens is I pull that lever and create vacuum. Then I open up the bleeder screw, and the fluid will come out, but air can't get in because I have attached this tube here. And then again, it's just a continuing cycle of creating vacuum and pulling the liquid out until I have this clear tubing here versus like a vacuum hose, which is opaque, so that I can see the fluid coming out. Because once I see the fluid is coming clear, then I know I'm good enough. And I also want to make sure that I don't see air bubbles coming through there as well. Now, as I'm doing this, I need to pay attention and keep filling the reservoir so that I don't run low. But basically, I'm just going to pull that vacuum, pull the liquid out, and as I'm doing that, I'll clear the system. And I'm going to do the same thing in the rear. That way I get rid of all the old fluid and any air in the caliper on the front and the rear, and we should be good to go. Okay, let's see if we can give this a shot if I can try to do this on camera. So I got some vacuum. I open up the lever. Here comes the fluid. I'm going to close it back up. There is some air there, but that's just because this tube is pretty big. Get some more vacuum. Open it up. There comes the fluid. Close it back up. I've been repeating this procedure until I get clear fluid coming out of here. This is closed right now. And so I just make sure I get my vacuum up, and it's filling this container here with the old fluid, and it is quite yellow. I don't know if you can see that on camera. But if I bring the camera up to the reservoir where I've been adding new fluid, you can see that's pretty much clear. So it is definitely older fluid, and it's making a difference. So I've done this for the front now, and now I'm just going to repeat the same procedure for the back, and we'll be good to go. And obviously when you test these new brakes out, you want to take it slow, let them break in for, I don't know, a couple 100 miles, something like that, before you go crazy. Incidentally, with brake fluid, I'm not positive about Dot 4, but I know Dot 3 used to be highly corrosive to paint. So make sure you put a nice thick rag down in case you drip it all. And other than that, you should be good to go. So the brake job's pretty easy on the Triumph. I have to say, I wish all the brake jobs that I do go this easy. So I'm pretty pleased, and we'll see how these things perform.